I'm recording. All right. Hey, coaches. Thanks for joining us here in this clinic and also taking the time to join us for the mental portion. So, we're going to really hit on mental performance in our presentation titled Increasing Team Performance Through Mental Performance Training. And I'm Allie, and this is Michelle, and we'll be walking you through it today. So, like I said, I'm Allie. I'll give you a little bit of my background here. I actually grew up in Georgia in the Atlanta area in Gwinnett County, and I played softball and also ran track in high school. I went on to playing softball collegiately at Berry College, where I received my bachelor's degree in psychology. After receiving that, I went on to receive my master's degree in sport and exercise psychology from Georgia Southern University. And during my time at Georgia Southern, I was able to work with many of the athletic teams there, individual athletes, and even just in the community too, working with high school level athletes and teams. So that was my experience there. Moving on from grad school, my first job out of that was working at an all girls golf academy where I was the mental performance coach working with high school athletes that had goals and ambitions to play collegiately and also professionally. My dream, though, was starting my own private practice, my own business in mental performance coaching. And so, starting in January 2020, I founded Head Games Consulting, where I'm now working with athletes all levels and in all sorts of sports on their mental game. And now I'll go ahead and let Michelle introduce herself because I brought her on in this journey as well with Head Games Consulting, and here she is.
So, hi, coaches. Thank you for joining us. So, like Ali said, my name is Michelle. I grew up in Florida, and then I went to Florida State University, where I got my bachelor's in psychology. I was also involved a lot in the sports psychology research lab there for about 3 years. Then I went on to Georgia Southern, which is where I met Ali. And I also received my master's in sport and exercise psychology, and also had the opportunity to work with a variety of athletes in different group settings as well as individual settings from various sports. And then once I graduated grad school, from then until now, I've been working as a contractor for the Army. So, as a mental performance coach as well, but with the soldier population. And then Ali and I have always worked really well together, and she decided to bring me on into her team. So now we're here.
Here we are. So you might be wondering at this point, what is mental performance training? And you may have an idea, right? We all know sports are mental, but I'll just go through and talk about a little bit of, what is this all and what do we do for athletes and teams? So we always like to start off by asking our clients how much of performance is mental, to which we receive an answer of about 60 to 90%. I don't know if that's what you thought in your mind, but that's usually what people will tell us. 60 to 90% of sport is mental. So then we follow up with that and we ask, well, if 60 to 90% is mental, how much time are you spending training your mind? To which we get a lot different answer. We might get a little bit, maybe here and there, to none, and definitely not with a professional who's implementing their training and following up with them and making sure that they are implementing training that is going to help them in their sport. So, our goal as mental performance coaches is to help athletes perform optimally and consistently on and off the field. And we do this through various research based techniques. So, all of what we're teaching, we said we went to school for this. All of what we're teaching is founded in research and literature. that has shown to be effective when working with athletes and performers at all levels. So, some examples of different mental skills that we might work on are listed here, but I'll go into a couple. So, building confidence is a huge one. So, when we talk about building confidence, confidence is such a general skill that athletes need in order to perform well on the field or the court or the track. Um, and by building confidence, we might use imagery to place an athlete in a situation where they can gain confidence through working through that situation in their mind. We might work on mindset and self talk. So, what are some ways that you are talking to yourself? What is your outlook and your perspective that might build confidence? Are we using more negative self talk? Are we using more effective self talk? So that's what we might use when we're trying to help our athletes build confidence. When we look at emotional regulation, another big one that Michelle and I both see when we're working with athletes for emotional regulation. So those athletes that might get heightened emotions when experiencing setbacks or um, different mistakes or not reaching their PR, their goals. They might experience those heightened emotions. So, what do we do with this? We might work on relaxation techniques. We might focus on mindfulness. So, how do we live in that present moment rather than being really future or past oriented? So these are just a couple examples of things that we will work on with our athletes. Today, though, we're really going to focus on motivation as an example of a mental skill. And the reason that we're focusing on this is because it is a huge predictor for success. So when we talk about motivation, that's really going to determine whether our teams and our athletes are going to be successful, whether they're going to gain enjoyment out of their sport. And another thing that we all want for our athletes is to be self motivated. So our athletes are maybe they'll be lifelong athletes, but they won't always compete competitively in the sport that they are playing or participating in right now. And so when we look at self motivation, we really want this skill to last long and to for our athletes to be able to use the skill of motivation in their careers, whatever field that they might go into and just in their lives in general. So this is a huge skill. It's very important. And our coaches, you know, you might think, how can I better motivate my athletes? But it's not really about how can I better motivate my athletes. It's how can I create an environment where my athletes are intrinsically or self-motivated. And so that's what we're going to talk to you about today is how do we create that environment? How do we go about creating that so that our athletes are self-motivated so that that self-motivation lasts for that long period of time. And what we want to avoid ultimately, which we'll get into a little bit as well, is burnout. So I know you experience this, your athletes experience this. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but we'll also talk about, motivation as it relates to burnout and why we want to avoid this. But with all of that being said, I'll let Michelle dive a little bit deeper into motivation with you all.
So, the motivation theory that we're going to focus on for this presentation is the self determination theory. So, research has identified that we as humans have three basic psychological needs. So, these aren't wants, these are psychological needs that everybody needs in order to thrive in their environment. And the environment that we're going to kind of focus on is going to be this whole team environment. So, the first need is going to be competence. So, competence is when you feel effective and capable of completing the task. And you're also able to learn from completing it or trying it out and grow from it. So you're learning and growing from it. And then the second need that we're going to focus on is going to be autonomy. So, autonomy is when you have a high degree of interest in what it is that you're doing and experiencing, and you're acting willingly and endorsing your own actions, so out of your own volition. And then for the third need, it's going to be relatedness. So, relatedness is when you feel like you matter, you're connected to others, extremely important when you're in a team setting to be able to work together and cohesively. And you also feel like you can contribute to the group as well. So, Ryan and Desi are researchers that propose that there's different sources of motivation that we pull from as individuals, which are what drive us to engage in different tasks. So we're going to go through this continuum of sources of motivation, and we're actually going to start all the way to the right where it says intrinsic motivation. So this is what Ali was referring to as to us wanting our athletes to be intrinsically motivated or self-motivated. So intrinsic motivation is when the task itself is what's enjoyable and is what's motivating you to participate in it. So inherent enjoyment of the activity itself. And I'll give you an example for me. So hiking and playing basketball, I enjoy the task for itself, for what they are, and no one has to force me or ask me to do it. It's just simply what I enjoy doing for what it is. And then everything else that's going to be on the arrow, that's going to be extrinsic motivation. So let's go ahead and start at the left of the arrow. And we're going to start with two sources of motivation that are going to be controlled forms of motivation. So the first one is going to be external regulation. So this is when you do something precisely because somebody else has a reward that they're going to give you if you do the activity or complete it, or a punishment that you'll suffer if you don't. So this one, external regulation, is going to be rewards and punishment. And this is not a weak form of motivation, but rather it's unstable. And it's because it's not going to last once the rewards and punishment aren't present anymore. So, to give you another personal example for me, running is not intrinsically motivating for me at all. But sometimes I run because then I can reward myself with a high carb meal, which I love. I love pasta. So, that's a way that I motivate myself, reward myself with a big bowl of pasta at the end. All right, and then for the second form of controlled motivation, we have interjection. So once again, a very pressured and controlling form of motivation, but the pressure is coming from within. So from within the individual. So you do it because if you don't accomplish the task or you don't do well at it, you're going to feel bad about yourself. So you can think of this one as shame or guilt. So the pressure of self-esteem and self-approval, it's what's driving this source. And if I'm using my running example, like I said, it's not intrinsically motivating for me, but sometimes I run because if I don't run, I won't feel good about myself, my body, my self-esteem, or how my health is. All right, and now for autonomous forms of motivation, which is where we want our athletes to be if they're not intrinsically motivated. So autonomous forms of motivation, the first one we're going to talk about is identification. So this is when you do something because you really identify with the worth or the value of engaging in that activity. So you see how important the outcome might be if you complete the task or engage in the task itself. So if I'm using my running example, I run because it keeps me healthy and in shape. So I really value the outcome of the health benefits that it has for my body. And it also helps me release stress. So I truly value the mental and physical health aspects from running. And then for the last one that we have on this arrow, also an autonomous form of motivation, and it's as close as intrinsic motivation as we can get to. And it's going to mimic some of those same benefits from intrinsic motivation. This is why we want our athletes to be there. So it's called integration, and this is when the identification fits with your values of who you are and what you identify as. So for example, if I'm using running, I run because I identify as an athlete. So that's what's motivating me, especially on those difficult days, what's going to get me up and running. And just to know, we're not solely just pulling from one of these sources of motivation every time we engage in a task, right? So it's going to be a combination. It's going to depend on the day, but we really want to get as close to intrinsic motivation on that arrow as possible. So let's talk about some of the outcomes of controlled motivation versus autonomous motivation. So for controlled outcomes, the athlete is going to feel pressure to feel, think, or behave in particular ways. There's also going to be rigid functioning. Well-being may also diminish, and depleted energy is going to be seen as well. The athlete may also feel alienated, and it just overall is going to undermine intrinsic motivation. Now, for the autonomous outcomes, so the individuals are going to have a sense of volition. And if you think about the three basic psychological needs when we were talking about the autonomy part, and then athletes are also going to have greater psychological health, more effective performances, and increased energy for self regulation. So, like I said, sometimes we're pulling from a combination of these sources. So, now I know that was a ton of information, but coaches, I just want you to just kind of sit for a minute and self reflect and just thinking about yourself as a coach. Where do you usually pull motivation from to coach? Is it going to be a combination of sources? Does it maybe depend on how stressed, overwhelmed you are? Maybe on those more difficult days, just kind of self reflecting on where is it that you usually pull motivation from to coach? And now, the second question that I want to leave you with is, how do you motivate your athletes? Is it usually rewards and punishment? And this is going to be extremely common for coaches or leaders. And like I said, it's 100% an effective form of motivation. We know that rewards and punishment 100% work. But individuals who are rewarded are less likely to persist in the activity during their free time. So if for you as a coach, it's important for your athletes and individuals to practice on their own time, it's going to be less likely when they're just used to receiving rewards and punishment. However, though, unexpected rewards actually don't undermine intrinsic motivation. So if your athletes don't know that they're going to be receiving an award, you have them accomplish a task and then you present the award after and they receive it, it's not going to undermine intrinsic motivation. So you can still use rewards with your athletes that way. And that's all I have for the arrow.
So, like Michelle said, controlled forms of motivation, they absolutely work to get our athletes motivated. And you might, as a coach, use those from time to time. But the research shows us that autonomous forms of motivation are linked to lower levels of athlete burnout. So, this is just another reason why these forms of motivation are so important to be implementing with our athletes as well, and to make sure that you're not always pulling from the controlled forms of motivation. And this is important because burnout is prevalent between coaches and athletes. Burnout is there, it happens. 70% of our youth are dropping out of sport before the age of 12 or 13. And yeah, some of this has to do with skill level and talent, of course. And some athletes are just going to go on versus others might not, and they might have other interests. But we are seeing that a lot of this has to do with athletes feeling burnout. And not just in the sense of being tired that we might think, but it goes a lot deeper than that. And coaches as well. You can see that coaches have one of the highest turnover rates of any job. And so being a coach is tiring, it's exhausting. And coaches absolutely experience burnout as well. But what is burnout? So I said it's not just being tired or feeling tired one day, right? But actually, Radecki and Smith in 1997 defined this burnout for athletes and coaches. And the three ways that we can tell whether an athlete or a coach might be experiencing burnout is by physical and or emotional exhaustion. So that's your being tired, but also emotionally as well, being exhausted. Sport devaluation, so you're seeing a lot less value in the sport that you were once passionate about. Even a coach on that end, having passion to coach that sport, you're seeing a lot less value in that yourself. And reduced sense of accomplishment. So no matter what's happening, you feel like you're just not accomplishing what you want to be accomplishing, or even if you're being successful, you never really feel like you're accomplishing much in your sport. So signs of this burnout. So when we're looking to our athletes, or if we're self-reflecting as a coach and how we're experiencing burnout, or if we might be experiencing burnout, and if our athletes might be experiencing that, going through the motions is a huge way to tell whether our athletes or ourselves are experiencing burnout. So, are we just going through the day? Are we just going through another practice because we have to be there, we're expected to be there? It goes back to the controlled forms of motivation. Is that our only motivation to show up and be there? Or are we just, going through the motions? That's one sign that you might be thinking, okay, hold up. I might be experiencing some burnout or feeling unsuccessful, like I said, or not good enough in that reduced sense of accomplishment. So feeling like, I hit my goals, but I'm really just at a standstill. I'm not really accomplishing much. And if your athletes are feeling the same way, or they're just not good enough, or no matter what they do, they feel like they can't reach those goals, burnout. That might be a sign of burnout. But it's easier to prevent burnout than it is to address it once it's happening. Once our athletes or ourselves are experiencing burnout, it's really hard to gain that energy back and gain that value back, or that sense of accomplishment. So we're really wanting to look at preventing that burnout rather than trying to catch up with it after it's already happening. So there are a few ways that both athletes and coaches can avoid this burnout. So, one way is having creative outlets or hobbies outside of sport. So, encouraging your athletes, or maybe spending time with your athletes, having those different creative outlets. Maybe, you spend some time painting as a team, or going on a hike as a team, just something different that's creative, that's outside the realm of what you would typically do for that sport. Another way that we can avoid burnout, it's been shown in the research that social support is really linked to lower levels of burnout. When we have support and we know we have that support, we are going to feel less burnout. So use your support system, use your family, encourage your athletes to do the same. And that support system will really help us fueling our tank and feeling full again, and uh, reducing that exhaustion that we're feeling. Another thing that we can do for our athletes, and that you can do for yourself, is seek help. Encourage your athletes to seek help. There's nothing wrong with asking for help or needing help, and you know that, but your athletes might not know that. And so encourage them to go out and seek an opinion from a professional or an expert, because there's no shame in doing so. And Another way that we can avoid this, and the last one I'll leave you with, is taking time off or having regular breaks. This is so, so important when it comes to that exhaustion aspect. Giving our bodies time to heal and to rest, and mentally to heal and to rest as well. I follow a lot of, we use social media a lot, and I follow a lot of coaches and athletic directors, college coaches in particular, and athletic directors. And I actually saw a recent post, I think it was from the athletic director at North Carolina, and talking about the no days off mindset and how it's destroying our athletes. Um, and it just got me to thinking about this presentation and why the no days off leads to burnout. And coaches, college coaches know that as well. And so having those regular breaks and encouraging your athletes to take a break and give themselves a break to recuperate is super important when we're talking about preventing burnout. And I'll let Michelle give you some ways forward as well when it comes to motivation.
So, circling back to our three basic needs that we first talked about when we were talking about the self determination theory, we want to leave you, coaches, with a few tips and tricks so you can foster an environment where your athletes are going to be more self motivated, or like we said, intrinsically motivated, by focusing on how do we increase these three needs and making sure that our athletes are receiving what they need. So, for autonomy, something you can do is just giving choices and options. So if you know that you have certain drills that you want to do, you can give them certain drills and let them choose what are the drills that they can pick for the day, or maybe different workouts, letting them maybe even run conditioning sessions. So giving choices and options is always going to be beneficial for the athlete. Then moving on to competence. So we're going to focus on two: giving constructive criticism and giving effective praise. So this is going to be extremely important because we know how important feedback is to be able to increase an individual's performance. So for constructive criticism, you want to focus on the specific change that it is that you want to see in the future, rather than thinking like what it is that they did negative from the past. So more so looking forward. And also the focus should be on what is the lesson learned from the mistake they committed, rather than blaming the individual for even making a mistake in the first place. And we know that individuals learn from their mistakes. So viewing it this way, and just what is the desired outcome that you want to see from your athlete, that way they know what is expected of them, what it is that they want to see, and they'll have feedback from you. And then the second part is the effective praise part. So we don't just want to say good job. We're all extremely guilty of just saying good job, great job, but that's not effective praise at all. You want the praise to be specific for the behavior that they did that you're praising and the effort, because it's just going to give them feedback. It's going to give them feedback on what it is that they did correct. And it's also going to show and probably just strengthen the relationship between you and the athlete, because it's showing that you're paying attention and that you care and you're noticing the progress and effort that they're putting into training. All right, and then for relatedness, so Ali hit on this a little bit. So team building activities are going to be extremely important for relatedness. And let's say you don't have time outside of sport for team building activities. Well, you are going to have to do conditioning sessions. So maybe changing the conditioning session and playing a sport, or playing a sport, or just doing an activity where you can make it competitive, make it fun. They're still getting a workout. And if you do have time outside of sport, like Ali said, doing painting or having a barbecue or dinner. I know right now it's maybe a little bit difficult because of COVID, but maybe doing Zoom sessions and playing games online. So this is just gonna help you get to know your athletes on a more personal level and not just solely for their sport identity. So We're saying that we want our athletes to be as close as possible to intrinsic motivation because it's important to know how it is that we identify and how our athletes identify and what their values are. So we want them to be as close to intrinsic motivation as possible. And we said that the closest way to get there is going to be the integration. So maybe a way to just start is by sitting down with your athletes and maybe sharing what are your personal values, and maybe then having them share what are their personal values. So now you're just building a better relationship with them and you're getting to know what is it that's going to motivate them, especially on those more difficult days. And then everybody will be able to hold themselves more accountable and just be more self motivated.
So I know that we just gave you a ton of information, and it's actually just a little chunk of all of the information that we have, not only about motivation, but also mental skills in general, and maybe some of those we listed on that first slide. So we're leaving our information here. If you have any questions or about motivation or any of the mental skills that we listed or just mental training in general, feel free to reach out. We love to talk about this stuff. We nerd out on this stuff. So feel free to reach out to us and ask us any questions that you may have. I know that this is weird because it's a virtual clinic, so you don't have a ton of time to ask us questions in person. So we thought it was really important to leave our information here so you have that option. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to potentially work with you if if you're interested or if possible. So yeah, feel free to reach out, and thank you again for attending our presentation and sitting here through it and listening to us kind of ramble about motivation. But we really wanted to get on here and share that with you. So thanks.
Thank you, coaches.